The Roman Forum was drenched in unease, the marble floors still echoing with the footsteps of conspirators who had struck down the man who called himself dictator for life. Julius Caesar, Rome's master, lay dead beneath the statue of Pompey, his body pierced with 23 wounds, the lifeblood of the Republic spilling into the Senate House. His assassins believed they had restored liberty, yet in truth they had only torn open the gates to chaos. The Republic did not breathe freely again. It gasped, convulsed, and staggered into another storm of blood. For in the vacuum left by Caesar's death, two men would rise, one seasoned by loyalty, passion, and military genius, the other a youth sharpened by ambition, patience, and a cold political instinct. Mark Antony and Octavian, allies once, enemies forever. Their struggle would burn across the Mediterranean and decide not only who ruled Rome, but whether the Republic itself would live or die. In the days immediately following Caesar's assassination in March of 44 BCE, Rome teetered on a knife's edge. The conspirators, men like Brutus and Cassius, proclaimed themselves liberators, saviors of the Republic. They paraded through the streets, waving their bloodied daggers to a public they expected to welcome them as heroes. But the crowd's response was uncertain. Caesar had been a dictator, but also a benefactor. He had lowered debts, rewarded veterans, and thrown games that dazzled the masses. To the urban poor, Caesar was not a tyrant but a patron. And above all, he had left behind one man who could speak to the people with fire, Mark Antony. Antony had been Caesar's right hand, his cavalry commander, his trusted ally in war and politics. Tall, imposing, a man of action more than of thought, he understood that power lay not in senatorial decrees, but in the hearts of Rome, its plebeians, and the loyalty of its soldiers. On the Ides of March, Antony had been held back from the Senate chamber, perhaps deliberately, perhaps by fate itself. He had survived the storm that killed his patron, and now he stepped forward, as the heir not by blood, but by allegiance. His position as consul gave him immediate authority, and his instinct was to seize the moment. In the funeral of Caesar, Antony orchestrated one of the most unforgettable spectacles in Roman history. Standing before the people, he unveiled the dictator's torn cloak, riddled with stab marks, and lifted Caesar's lifeless body for all to see. With every gesture, he fanned the crowd's fury. His words dripped with grief and rage, reminding Rome not of Caesar's power, but of his generosity, his will, his love for the people. He read aloud the dictator's testament, revealing that Caesar had left money and land for the citizens of Rome. The crowd, once silent in uncertainty, now erupted in anger. They rioted, burning the houses of the conspirators, driving Brutus and Cassius into retreat. Antony had transformed himself from consul into the voice of vengeance. Yet even as the city burned, another player entered the stage, a figure few had taken seriously until then. Gaius Octavius, known later as Octavian, was just 18 years old when he received word of his great-uncle's death. Caesar had adopted him in his will, making him not only heir to the family name, but to the immense wealth and prestige that came with it. No one expected much from the youth. He was pale, frail in health, more scholar than soldier. But beneath his quiet exterior burned an ambition as relentless as Rome had ever seen. Against the advice of his mother and his friends, Octavian sailed to Italy to claim his inheritance. Where others saw an inexperienced boy, he saw himself as Caesar's son, destined to avenge his father's murder and rule in his place. The stage was now set for a collision. Antony, the general who commanded legions and the love of the mob, Octavian, the adopted son, armed with a name more powerful than legions. Each claimed to be Caesar's rightful heir. Each sought to destroy the conspirators. But in truth, each also sought to destroy the other. The question was not whether Rome would endure another civil war, but when the flames would ignite. The first sparks came in the struggle over Caesar's legacy. Antony, wielding his power as consul, tried to control Caesar's fortune and appointments, positioning himself as the true successor. Octavian, furious, began recruiting supporters from Caesar's veterans, offering them money out of his own pocket to buy their loyalty. The Senate, meanwhile, played its own dangerous game. Distrustful of Antony's raw ambition, Men like Cicero saw in Octavian a useful counterweight, a young pawn who could be used to curb Antony's growing power. Cicero, ever the master of oratory, launched a campaign of scathing speeches known as the Philippics, denouncing Antony as a would-be tyrant. His words gave Octavian legitimacy, turning the boy into the Senate's weapon against Antony. And so, the uneasy alliance between Caesar's heir and Caesar's lieutenant crumbled. Antony marched north to secure his own command, while Octavian won over more legions to his side. The conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, once enemies of both, slipped away to the eastern provinces, raising armies for their own defense. Rome became a chessboard, every piece in motion, every alliance a trap. The Republic the assassins thought they had saved now fractured into three camps: the liberators, Antony, and Octavian. What none of them knew was that the Republic itself was already dead, and from its corpse would rise not freedom but empire. The first great confrontation came at Mutina in 43 BCE. Antony, besieging a rival in northern Italy, found himself opposed not only by Octavian, but by the combined forces of the Senate. The battles that followed were brutal, filled with shifting loyalties and betrayals. Octavian proved himself more capable than expected, leading troops with surprising courage. Antony, though seasoned, suffered defeat and was forced to retreat. It seemed, for a brief moment, that the Senate had triumphed, and Octavian had fulfilled their hopes. But then, the wheel turned again. The Senate tried to strip Octavian of his command, treating him once more as a pawn rather than a partner. The young man would not be so easily dismissed. He marched his legions on Rome, demanding recognition, and the Senate, too weak to resist, capitulated. Now came one of the most astonishing reversals in Roman history. Antony, defeated but not destroyed, found in Octavian not an eternal rival but a potential ally. Both men recognized a greater threat: Brutus and Cassius, the conspirators gathering strength in the east. Their enmity could wait. Vengeance came first. In a grand, almost unthinkable act of realpolitik, Antony, Octavian, and another of Caesar's allies, Lepidus, formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship with absolute power over Rome. To seal their pact, they unleashed one of the most infamous purges in Roman memory, the proscriptions. Lists of enemies were drawn up, names posted publicly, fortunes seized, and men hunted down in the streets. Senators, equestrians, and even old allies were slaughtered, their wealth feeding the triumvir's war machine. Among the victims was Cicero himself, the great orator who had dared to challenge Antony. His head and hands were nailed to the rostra, a grim warning of what resistance meant. Rome had traded Caesar's single dictatorship for a rule of three, and its streets ran with blood. Yet the bloodshed did not end in Rome. With their power secured, Antony and Octavian turned east to face Brutus and Cassius. The stage shifted to Macedonia, to the plains near Philippi, where in 42 BCE the final act of the liberators was played out. The armies of the triumvirs, swollen with legions, clashed against those of the conspirators in one of the largest battles Rome had ever seen. The fight stretched across two engagements, filled with confusion, courage, and despair. Brutus fought with valor. Cassius despaired at a false report and took his own life. And in the end, the liberators were crushed. Antony distinguished himself with skill and command, while Octavian played a lesser role, ill during much of the campaign. Still, victory belonged to both, and with Brutus's suicide, the dream of restoring the Republic died upon his sword. But even as Antony and Octavian celebrated their triumph, the seeds of their rivalry had already begun to sprout once more. The empire was too vast, their ambitions too great, their temperaments too opposed. The world was not wide enough for both to rule. After Philippi, the Mediterranean seemed to bend under the weight of Antony and Octavian's victory. The Republic was gone, its defenders dead or scattered, and the triumvirs divided the spoils of empire between them. Lepidus was given Africa, a distant corner of little consequence. Octavian took the west, including Italy, and the troubled lands of Gaul and Spain, and Antony claimed the east, the richest provinces of Rome, where kingdoms still bowed in uneasy loyalty, and where gold armies and ancient thrones lay waiting to be commanded. For Antony, the East promised more than wealth. It promised glory. Caesar had dreamed of new conquests in Parthia, the empire beyond the Euphrates that had humiliated Crassus at Carrhae. Antony, inheriting his master's ambition, saw himself as the man to avenge that defeat and carry Rome's eagles further than any had dared. Yet his march eastward brought him into the orbit of another power, one not forged in Roman steel, but in Egyptian splendor. Cleopatra VII, Queen of the Nile, daughter of pharaohs, a woman whose wit was as sharp as her beauty was legendary. She had been Caesar's lover once, bearing him a son, Caesarion, and in the chaos following his death she had secured her throne with cunning and force. Now, as Antony sought allies and resources for his great campaign, Cleopatra stepped forward as both benefactor and seductress. The meeting of Antony and Cleopatra at Tarsus in 41 BCE became the stuff of legend. She sailed up the Cydnus River, not as a supplicant queen but as a goddess incarnate. Reclining upon a barge adorned with purple sails and golden oars, her attendants dressed as nymphs, the air perfumed with incense. Antony, who loved spectacle and grandeur, was enchanted. The alliance that followed was both political and personal. Cleopatra pledged Egypt's wealth to his ambitions. Antony gave her his loyalty, his passion, and soon enough his children. In Rome, whispers began that Antony had fallen under the spell of an Eastern temptress, a dangerous distraction from his duties. But for Antony, Cleopatra represented not weakness, but possibility. With her he could fuse Roman power and Egyptian wealth, forging a dominion that spanned from the Tiber to the Nile, from the Aegean to the deserts beyond the Euphrates. Meanwhile, Octavian faced challenges of a different kind. His share of the empire, though smaller in wealth, carried the heart of Roman identity. Italy was restless, veterans clamored for land, and the people groaned under the weight of endless war. Octavian's task was not to dazzle, but to endure, to grind through the discontent and forge a stable base from which to wield power. He proved himself master of patience, using propaganda, patronage, and ruthless calculation to bind the West to him. Where Antony sought glory in conquest, Octavian sought legitimacy at home. It was in this struggle for legitimacy that Octavian found his greatest weapon, the art of image. He portrayed himself not as a tyrant, not even as Caesar's avenger, but as the guardian of Rome's traditions, the protector of its morals, the defender of its future. Antony, by contrast, became the villain of his story, a Roman gone astray, corrupted by an Eastern queen, forgetting his duty to the city that had made him. Octavian's propaganda was subtle but relentless, casting Antony as a man who had traded Rome for Alexandria, discipline for decadence. The more Antony tied himself to Cleopatra, the more Octavian's narrative seemed to ring true. But the rivalry was not yet open war. The second triumvirate, renewed after Philippi, still bound Antony and Octavian together, if uneasily. Their alliance was sealed not only by necessity, but by family, for Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, a union meant to bridge the growing chasm. Octavia, dignified and loyal, played her part well, attempting to mediate between her husband and her brother. For a time it seemed possible that peace might hold, that the triumvirs could govern their realms without tearing Rome apart again. Yet fate, as ever, had other designs. Antony's Parthian campaign in 36 BCE turned to disaster. Despite his preparations and Cleopatra's support, the expedition was plagued by harsh terrain, betrayal by allies, and fierce Parthian resistance. His legions suffered, retreating in misery, their confidence shaken. Antony returned not as a conqueror, but as a commander scarred by failure. Cleopatra, however, remained steadfast, offering him sanctuary in Alexandria, where the comforts of court and the promise of renewal awaited. This retreat into Egypt deepened the perception in Rome that Antony had abandoned his heritage. Octavian seized on every rumor, every excess. He painted Cleopatra as a sorceress, Antony as her thrall, declaring that the general no longer sought to serve Rome, but to found a dynasty in the East, ruling not as consul or imperator, but as king. For Romans, the very word king was poison. Octavian understood this, and he poured it into the ears of the Senate and the people, weaving a tale of treason that blurred truth and fiction. Antony's love for Cleopatra became, in Octavian's hands, a dagger aimed at the heart of the Republic. Still, Octavian knew that words alone could not decide the future. He needed victory, both military and symbolic, to extinguish Antony's challenge. That opportunity came when Antony formally divorced Octavia and declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Caesar, as the rightful heir of Julius Caesar. This act was Octavian's masterstroke. He proclaimed that Antony sought to disinherit him, Rome's adopted son of Caesar, in favor of an illegitimate half-Egyptian child. The insult was intolerable, the threat unmistakable. Octavian declared that Antony had betrayed Rome itself. The Senate, swayed by Octavian's rhetoric and by fear of Cleopatra's power, stripped Antony of his offices. What followed was not simply another civil war, but a war presented as a crusade to save Rome from foreign corruption. Octavian positioned himself as the champion of Italy, the defender of Roman values, while Antony and Cleopatra became the enemies of tradition, accused of plotting to enthrone themselves as monarchs over East and West alike. As fleets were built and armies mustered, the Mediterranean held its breath. The world had watched Caesar and Pompey clash, then Antony and Octavian rise from the ashes of that struggle. Now, it would witness the final act of the Republic's death, played out not in the streets of Rome, but upon the sea, where oars and sails would decide the future of empire. And so the war that had smoldered in whispers and propaganda erupted into open conflict. The year was 31 BCE, and all eyes turned to Greece, to the narrow waters off Actium, where fate had prepared a stage for the greatest naval battle of Rome's history. The waters of the Ionian Sea shimmered beneath the late summer sun as two vast fleets prepared to meet. On one side stood Mark Antony and Cleopatra, their combined forces stretching across the horizon, more than 500 ships, many of them massive leviathans bristling with towers, catapults, and armored decks. On the other side, leaner, swifter, commanded by the calculating hand of Agrippa. Octavian's admiral were some 400 vessels, smaller in size but built for maneuver, speed, and endurance. It was September 2nd, 31st BCE, and the future of Rome was balanced upon the waves at Actium. The lead-up to this confrontation had been shaped not by Antony's boldness, but by Agrippa's brilliance. Octavian himself, no general of Caesar's caliber, had leaned heavily on his friend and commander. Agrippa struck deep into Antony's supply lines, seizing key bases along the Greek coast and cutting off his access to fresh provisions. Disease and desertion gnawed at Antony's army, while Octavian's legions, better fed and supplied, grew stronger with each passing month. Antony's decision to keep his fleet concentrated at Actium was a gamble. He hoped to break through, sail to Egypt, and regroup where his power base remained secure. But to do so, he would have to run the gauntlet of Octavian's navy, and Agrippa was determined not to let him escape. As dawn broke on the day of battle, Antony's fleet rode out of the Gulf of Ambracia, their great galleys advancing like a floating fortress. Octavian's smaller ships fanned out to meet them, nimble predators darting at the edges of Antony's formation. For hours the fleets clashed in brutal struggle, oars shattering, rams splintering hulls, warriors leaping from deck to deck in savage combat. Antony's colossal ships proved hard to sink. Their size made them nearly invulnerable to ramming. Yet their very bulk betrayed them. Slow, unwieldy, they became easy targets for fire and maneuver. Agrippa's squadrons harried them relentlessly, using speed as their weapon, whittling down Antony's advantage with every engagement. And then came the moment that would echo through history. Amid the chaos, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships suddenly broke away from the line, their sails unfurling to catch the wind. To friend and foe alike, it seemed a retreat. Cleopatra, fearing entrapment, had resolved to flee the battle, carrying Egypt's treasure and her own survival with her. Seeing her flagship turn southward, Antony was torn between duty and desire. His love for Cleopatra, his faith in their shared destiny overcame his general's instinct. He left the battle, abandoning his fleet to follow her into the open sea. The sight of their commander fleeing broke the spirit of Antony's men. Some continued to fight bravely, but most knew the day was lost. Surrounded and demoralized, the great fleet crumbled under Octavian's assault. Ship after ship was captured, burned, or surrendered. By nightfall, Actium was no longer a battle but a rout. Octavian's navy stood victorious, Antony's forces shattered, his reputation in ruins. The consequences of Actium were immediate and immense. Antony and Cleopatra, fleeing to Egypt, retained a fraction of their power, but the illusion of invincibility had been shattered. Octavian's triumph was not merely military, it was moral. He returned to Rome not as a warlord but as the savior of the Republic, the man who had defeated a traitor enthralled to a foreign queen. His propaganda reached its zenith. Antony was painted not as a noble rival, but as a man who had surrendered his Roman soul to Eastern decadence, who had abandoned discipline for love, country for passion. Cleopatra, once seen as a queen of splendor, was now cast as the serpent of the Nile, the witch who had almost ensnared Rome itself. Yet for Antony and Cleopatra, the end had not yet come. They retreated to Alexandria, preparing for a last stand. Their bond, scorned in Rome, remained unbroken. Cleopatra marshaled her wealth, Antony rallied what soldiers remained loyal, and together they dreamed of reversing fate. But destiny had turned against them. Octavian, cautious yet relentless, advanced upon Egypt, determined to crush his enemies once and for all. In 30 BCE, Alexandria fell. Antony, defeated in battle once more, took his own life in the arms of Cleopatra, declaring that he would not live to see himself paraded in chains. Cleopatra, captured but defiant, chose death by poison, the bite of an asp, over humiliation in Octavian's triumph. Their deaths ended more than their romance. They ended the last challenge to Octavian's supremacy. Egypt, the last great independent kingdom of the Hellenistic age, was annexed as a Roman province. Octavian returned to Rome, his enemies gone, his rivals dead, his power unchallenged. The Senate, weary of war, granted him titles and honors, cloaking absolute authority in the garments of tradition. He became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, master not only of armies, but of the hearts and minds of the people. The Republic, already mortally wounded, was now a memory, replaced by an empire that would endure for centuries. The rivalry of Antony and Octavian had begun as a struggle between heirs of Caesar, two men bound by loyalty to the same master, but divided by ambition. It ended as a parable of fate, of how passion and calculation, love and propaganda could reshape the world. Antony, remembered as the great soldier undone by love, and Octavian remembered as the cold statesman who outlasted them all, together forged the transition from republic to empire. Their civil war, more than any before it, determined not only who ruled Rome, but what Rome would become. And yet as the dust settled and Augustus stood supreme, one cannot help but wonder, was this the victory of Rome, or its final surrender? The Republic was gone, its liberties dissolved into a monarchy cloaked in ancient names. The empire rose, dazzling and immense, but at its foundation lay rivers of Roman blood, shed not for freedom, but for the ambitions of men who could not share power. The ghosts of Caesar, Brutus, Antony, Cleopatra, all lingered in the memory of Rome. Their choices, their passions, their betrayals had shaped the destiny of a world. And in the quiet aftermath of Actium and Alexandria, a single figure emerged from the shadows of civil war, destined to rule an empire of marble, Augustus, the man who had outplayed them all. The smoke of Actium and the silence of Alexandria did not simply mark the end of two lives or the defeat of one side in a war. They marked the end of an era. For centuries, Rome had prided itself on being a republic, a state without kings, where no man could place himself above the law, where magistrates were chosen and power was shared. That system had survived Hannibal, Mithridates, Spartacus, and countless storms, but it could not survive the ambitions of its own children. The death of Caesar had not saved it, the struggle of Brutus and Cassius had not restored it, and the rivalry of Antony and Octavian had not revived it. What emerged instead was something new, something greater and yet more dangerous, an empire. Antony, in the eyes of later Romans, became a tragic figure. He was remembered as a man of immense talent, second only to Caesar in the field, but undone by flaws of character. His courage was never questioned, nor his loyalty to his soldiers, but his passions ruled him more than his judgment. In the Roman imagination, his love for Cleopatra became the symbol of his downfall. the soldier seduced into weakness, the Roman who abandoned Rome for the luxuries of the East. In truth, Antony's story was more complex. He sought not merely Cleopatra's love, but her throne, her wealth, her ancient legacy, as tools to forge a power base strong enough to rival Octavian's. But history, written by the victor, reduced him to the man who chose a queen over a republic. Cleopatra herself became even more myth than woman. To Octavian's propagandists, she was the serpent of the Nile, a foreign temptress who nearly enslaved Rome. To poets and dramatists of later ages, she became the embodiment of fatal beauty, a queen whose charm and courage made even the sternest Roman falter. Her death, proud and defiant, ensured that she would be remembered not as a captive dragged in chains, but as a sovereign who chose her own fate. In her, the line of pharaohs ended, but the legend of Egypt as a land of mystery and majesty endured. Octavian, the survivor, outlasted them all. Cold where Antony was hot, patient where Antony was reckless, cautious where Antony was bold, he proved that in the end, it was not always strength or bravery that decided the world's destiny, but endurance and calculation. He wrapped his power in the cloak of tradition, presenting himself as the first citizen rather than a monarch, yet his authority was absolute. By the time he took the name Augustus, Rome was no longer a republic in truth, but a monarchy in all but name. He lived long, ruled wisely, and left behind a system that would carry the empire for centuries. Yet his reign was built upon rivers of blood. The deaths of Caesar, Cicero, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, Cleopatra, and countless thousands who perished in the wars that tore the republic apart. The story of Antony and Octavian is not merely the story of two men, but of Rome itself. It is the story of how personal rivalries can consume nations, how love and ambition can reshape history, how propaganda can prove as mighty as armies. It asks questions that echo far beyond antiquity. What is freedom worth if people long for stability? Can a republic survive ambition without limit? And when victory comes, is it ever free of tragedy? For Rome, the civil war after Caesar did not bring back liberty, nor did it restore the old balance. Instead, it created something both greater and darker, an empire that conquered the world, but could never fully escape the shadow of the republic it destroyed. Antony died believing himself defeated, but in truth his struggle gave birth to Augustus's triumph. Cleopatra perished with her throne, yet her legend lived longer than Rome itself, and Octavian, crowned in the ashes of his rivals, became Augustus, the man who turned civil war into empire, who reshaped Rome into the capital of a world. Their rivalry, their choices, their loves and betrayals left a mark so deep that even now, 2,000 years later, we speak their names. Antony and Octavian, soldier and statesman, passion and patience, fire and stone, locked in a struggle that ended one world and began another. And as history looks back upon the fall of the Republic and the rise of empire, one truth remains unshaken. Rome was not destroyed by foreign invaders or barbarian hordes, but by Romans themselves, men who could not share power, who fought not for liberty but for mastery. From Caesar's death to Actium's waves, the Republic bled itself dry, and in its place rose Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The curtain falls, but the echo remains, a reminder that in the hearts of men lies both the glory and the ruin of nations.